As I had stated in my previous video on Animats, souls are of incredible importance in the world of Eora, far more so than most fantasy settings, and it is on this point that I'd like to talk about a related subject, that of vessels, something that might be referred to as undead in a more conventional fantasy world. As mentioned in the previous video, the so-called wheel is a natural feature of Eora that is responsible for maintaining the cycle of birth and rebirth of souls. Normally, when a soul dies, it enters the in-between, a kind of purgatory-like place, where souls wander about, to and fro, and eventually into the beyond, the realm of the gods, and enter a queue for reincarnation, whereupon the soul is reincarnated in a new body. Only kith souls operate in this manner, and in this sense one can understand souls as loans being made to mortal kith. The soul substance belongs, if one were to employ this word, to the wheel, and mortals are, by way of analogy, lent souls, which return to the wheel to be loaned out again to new mortals as this process is continuous. And as this process is continuous, any given soul might have occupied many different lives, something that watchers, a kind of soul seer, can often see when observing other mortal kith, which is, of course, a subject for another time in another video. Here's where things become tricky. If one perceives souls as a loan from the beyond, then one must also be aware of the possibility of keeping the loan and not paying it back, to maintain the analogy. There are unspecified rituals that allow for individuals to detach their souls from the wheel. Once done, the soul then belongs to the individual, but also leads to a new set of conditions and prerequisites for continued existence. This leads to a need to sustain the soul with external resources. Normally, a soul is maintained by it being bound to the process of the wheel, but once detached, the soul then requires sustenance from without, meaning sources of energy that can maintain the soul once it is detached from the wheel. Usually, and unfortunately, this is often found in living matter, i.e. the flesh and blood of living beings. Once a being has had its soul severed from the wheel, it becomes what is called a vessel, effectively an undead creature by normal fantasy standards, and in order to preserve its existence, such a being must routinely consume sources of soul energy. Often this takes the form of living flesh and blood, but Adra, a type of stone used in Animats, can also be used sometimes. More often than not, though, a vessel will be confined to consuming the flesh and blood of a living kith. This is done in order to prevent both physical and mental decay that, barring continual external sustenance, is inevitable. As such, vessels exist in a state of hierarchy, of the most complete in terms of mental faculties and physical state, to the least complete. When a being first attaches its soul from the wheel, it becomes what is called a vampire. This is the highest form of vessel, or undead, inasmuch as they retain all their memories, they appear mostly or fully intact, and often have additional abilities such as the power to charm and command kith. However, as mentioned prior, vampires require sustenance from either Adra or living beings, preferably kith, to sustain themselves, meaning flesh and blood, and should they not do this, they will degenerate. For vessels, this mental and physical degeneration is inevitable, and vampires are acutely aware of this, and therefore do everything in their power to stave off this decay. As a consequence, some vampires engage in reckless behavior or extreme hedonism, realizing that decay is unavoidable, whilst others are exceedingly cautious, hoping to forever forestall the decline. Eventually, though, all vampires fall to the decay, whereupon they enter the next stage, that of the Dargul. The Dargul represents the first irreversible step of decay and decline of vessels, whose dead flesh requires soul energy to be maintained. Darguls are not as well preserved as vampires and suffer from noticeable decay and fraying around the edges. They have also lost some of their mental faculties due to cognitive degeneration, but retain enough to be intelligent and cunning, and are self-aware enough to realize that they are losing themselves bit by bit. They tend to be more reckless and daring than vampires, due to lower impulse control and likely greater hunger for flesh. The next stage of decline is that of the ghoul. Ghouls retain an instinctive cunning, perhaps akin to that of a smart animal or predator, but lack the relative intelligence of Darguls and the complex intelligence of vampires. Their appearance is such that they are immediately recognizable as undead and not alive. They often inhabit graveyards and other forlorn places. But once a ghoul slips past its current state, it becomes a revenant, which also signifies the final departure from anything resembling humanoid intelligence. All they have left is their hunger and instinct to feed, and they resemble nothing less than rotting corpses. And the last and final stage of this sort of vessel is the skeleton. Skeletons do not experience hunger or the need to feed, and are effectively automatons, attacking based on reflex alone. Eventually, though, even the bones of a skeleton will crumble and be rendered to dust, all the while with the soul still being bound to the dust and bones. Thus far, we've only spoken of vessels that were former kith, but there are other types of vessels, so-called Animats, which are souls, more often than not, willingly bound to armor and constructions, typically made of adra and copper, the materials that are most soul-conductive. Such constructs are remarkably resilient and powerful, and usually come into being when volunteers devoted to a cause offer up their soul to that particular cause, although souls can forcibly be joined to such things as well. The less willing a soul, the more likely an individual Animat will rebel or fail in its duty, often violently discharging itself in the process. If one were to look for a fantasy analog to the Animat, then the golem rather than undead might be closest. Not all undead, however, are conventional vessels, or Animats, even if most are. There are two types of undead that cannot be classified as normal vessels: death guards and liches. The death guard is the only naturally occurring undead in all of Eora, and its existence is occasioned by the most unusual of circumstances. Death guards come into existence through sheer force of will. When an individual dies, and he possesses both a powerful soul and utter determination, that individual can be reborn or continue as a death guard. Unlike most vessels, which require the flesh of the living to sustain themselves, and are the result of meddling of some sort, death guards birth themselves, and as such are not subject to limitations such as decay and need for sustenance, as their own wills fuel their existence. Paladins, and sometimes priests, are most often death guards. Amongst the most powerful undead, death guards can pin souls to corpses and thus create vessels in their service, and possess numerous additional magical abilities and resistances. And then there's Lich, which is likely familiar to many viewers, albeit with some Eoran twists. Lich status is a self-imposed condition. It requires a wizard to carve intricate ruins into his own skull, overlaid by complex spellcraft and spellweaving. And finally, the wizard must drill a hole into his forehead and plug it close with an adra stone. Having done this, in addition to further rituals, the Lich is able to bind his soul to his body without suffering from the inevitable decay of conventional vessels. Through this ritual and powerful sorcery, the Lich does not decline, at least mentally, in the same way that most vessels do. The skin does become translucent and pale, but no actual rotting takes place. Mortal wizards become Liches for any variety of reasons: to escape death, to expand magical learning, and other reasons you might imagine. Now, as I'll be covering Avowed lore fairly systematically, do let me know about Avowed lore topics you would like to learn about or are interested in. And if spoiler-based topics and discussion are okay, let me know as well. So, as usual, leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I will check you out next time. Take care.